Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. I recently created an audio-visual presentation which I called the Director's Cut. It seems to have gone down pretty well. Now that's quite a rewarding thing, and I thank those who made such nice comments. This got me thinking that it seems to me to be a fact of life that you can pour your heart and soul into two projects, but one sinks like a stone while the other may soar, and trying to put your finger on why is almost impossible. Now I suspect that all creative projects may be very similar. Even the best songwriters in the world write the odd bummer. What I'd like to do here is to dissect the presentation I made and invite you to look over my shoulder as I explain the way I go about creating the creativity in audio-visual. Is that going to be any interest to you? I hope so, but stick around a few minutes and let's see. I've been creating audio-visual presentations for quite some time, and if you do anything long enough you tend to get better at it, even if you're not really trying that hard. And we do seem to improve with age. Well, that's the theory anyway, but we're also fallible. I first became involved with audiovisual back in the early 80s with two Kodak carousel projectors, which you can see on screen. Cost a fortune, they did. I also had a Kodak electronic dissolve control, a 4-track Fostex tape deck which allowed me to record all 4 tracks in one direction on a standard cassette tape. And of course, if you was going to show your sequences around the camera clubs, which is what I did, you need an amplifier, speakers, a huge array of wires, and also lots of film too. My interest in audiovisual actually goes back to the 70s, because when I joined a photographic club, the very first thing I saw on the first evening I attended was an audio-visual using equipment like we can see on screen here. Now I thought this was a great way to show pictures, colour slides projected in a darkened room and accompanied by music. It was great. Now my views have never changed. The only thing that has changed is the method, and that's changed for the better. The Director's Cut is a pictorial slideshow. We sometimes hear these referred to as photo harmony, but I wonder if it needs a little explanation. It's when we want to show images that have not been specifically shot to illustrate a story, a poem, or maybe a documentary, and the show may even contain images with wildly different content. In this case, it's the images that drive the idea and the desire to present them. But with the absence of a story, and many audiovisual enthusiasts would say it lacks a start, a middle and an end, we can often start off at a bit of a disadvantage. And that means we have to make up for this in other ways. It's the pictorial nature that gives me my first problem, because a pictorial show is built around images. Therefore, the images need to be good. Now, what do we mean when we say good? And how do I define that in a subjective medium like photography? Now, I suppose it depends on the audience you're intending to show the audio-visual to. But let's assume here it's a camera club full of photographic enthusiasts. Clubs do tend to have a pretty good photographic standard, and that standard doesn't change very much no matter where you are in the world. That's my experience. So when I say good images, I mean images of a standard that general camera club members would be willing to sit and view. Maybe we could say they are a little above average, and I don't think that's a bad way to describe them. We could also say that perhaps they would be reasonably high scorers in club competitions, and therefore able to retain the interest of a photographic group, at least for a while, and we'll talk about how long a little later. So here I'm thinking about a photographer who has some good images stored on their computer, and they want to present them in an attractive enough way so that the viewer is not reaching for the escape key to end their presentation part the way through. We only need the viewer's time for about 3 to 5 minutes. So it shouldn't really be beyond any photographer to be able to generate the interest to achieve this. In audiovisual circles, we tend to say that you begin making a slideshow by selecting a batch of images. You then select from those images the ones you actually want to use. Sort them into a running order, pick a piece of music, and synchronize the images to that music. Well, I've oversimplified the process a little bit here, haven't I? But it's basically what we do. Now, I used to work like this, but I don't anymore. When we're new to audiovisual, we do seem to need an order and a structure to work to. But once we become familiar with the software and the AV techniques, we tend to work differently. We develop our own style. So where do I start when I decide to make a pictorial slideshow? I will generally start with just a couple of images in a project folder. The idea is going to be driven by the images, as we've already discussed, but it could be a bit of a vague idea at the start. I have quite a number of folders on my computer which contain 3 or 4 images and maybe 1 or 2 tracks of music. These are audiovisual ideas that never got off the drawing board. There are times where an idea just peters out before I really get started. I test the water with a few images and sometimes a couple of different styles of music, but there are times when it just doesn't gain traction, and I think that's probably the nature of creativity. So I think the enthusiasm that originally got me started on any project has suddenly died. Now, sometimes it can be brought back to life a few weeks later if we come back and look again, sometimes not. I think we have to be in the right mood to create an audiovisual because it's a longer creative process, I guess. Now, if we take the slideshow I've mentioned here, the director's cut, this AV has given me a vehicle to display the images, which is what I think audiovisual and certainly pictures to exe does best. Now, I started my slideshow with just 2 monochrome images in my project folder. I couldn't think of a title at the start, so I just added the word title in an appropriate place on the first image where it looked right for size and position. Now, the title is where things can start going wrong, but you must understand that these are my personal views. Not everyone will agree, and of course we're always going to be able to find the odd exception. Titles with huge fonts like this, bad colour and style that almost entirely fill the screen give a very bad first impression, because they look a bit, well, I hate to say this, but amateur. I think I'd also add those titles with fancy, hard to read fonts like this, where it looks like the author has added them because they happened to stumble across them in their font list, rather than because they are the most appropriate choice. Now, I've made lots of fancy titles in my time, but very often simple can be the most stylish. It is very hard to beat white text on a black background, and sometimes that white doesn't even have to be white. Now, that sounds a little odd, doesn't it? But an off-white is often slightly easier on the eye. And of course the direct reverse is also true. Black text on a white background is also difficult to beat, and in both cases a simple, easy to read font is often better. Keep it simple, keep it stylish, Keep the text reasonably small but easy to read, and if your opening image is appropriate, we can put the title over the image. Here's another problem with titles that I avoid like the plague. Just imagine this: the slideshow begins, the music begins to play, a simple two-word title appears on screen, and then it just sits there. The music continues to play, but the text stays there long enough to read it once, read it twice, read it 3 times. If it's over the top of an image, we look around the image and come back and read the text again, until you start to think that the presentation has hit a technical problem and the image has frozen on screen. This type of error will put a very serious dent in the good first impression you're trying to make to your audience. I've seen this done quite a bit. My title actually comes on screen with just a 1-second fade, and I'll bet that the viewers will have read that title in half that time before it's even faded fully on screen. Even though my title may be read in a very short time, I can't take it off screen too quickly. That just looks rushed and wrong. The director's cut title is on screen for 5 seconds in total, but that includes about 4 seconds of fade time. So my title is only fully on screen for about 1 second, but it works fine. Now let me be a little politically incorrect here, but perhaps a little more truthful. If a slideshow is beginning to bore the viewer just a little, and they haven't even got past the title, what message is being sent for the remainder of the show? That's what I mean when I say it's not a good first impression. I make the assumption that I have a window of opportunity at the start of my show where I can grab the viewer's attention and say to them, this presentation is worth a few minutes of your time. Good titles and well synchronized opening images are going to be pretty vital for this. With this slideshow, I didn't have a story. I didn't have a start, middle and end, which most audiovisual enthusiasts try to achieve. So I had to think of other ways to add interest, and that very first interest is the images themselves, hence the fact it's a pictorial slideshow. What I also try to avoid is my own confirmation bias, which will trick me into slipping into my slideshow a few weak images because I'm a few short. Confirmation bias will keep telling me that no one's going to notice, but they will, and later on so will I, and so will you. So while still thinking about adding interest and appeal to a pictorial slideshow, I'm going to give a lot of time and trouble to transitions and the synchronization of the music. I need to make sure that's pretty much impeccable, and it also means looking at other visually interesting effects like animation and the third image. Now of course I'm getting away from myself a little bit here because as yet we haven't chosen a piece of music. Now there's some great easy listening and copyright free music that is available to us. I like that style of music, I've used that style of music, but sometimes, and especially with a pictorial slideshow like this, I need something a little different. I can't really beat about the bush here. I need some inspirational music to help me lift my images and produce that 3 to 5 minutes of interesting content. My pictures alone are not going to do that. Audio-visual is where the end result is hopefully greater than the sum of the two parts, the music and the images. Well, that's certainly the plan. So finding the right music can be a real difficult part for a pictorial slideshow. When music inspires the shooting of the images, we're generally home and dry. But here we have to search a bit. I was saying earlier on about some of my failed projects. If you do look into some of my audiovisual project folders, you can often find several pieces of music that I've tried before I've settled on the final one. So I may start my slideshow in several different ways, but what I find is the strongest always shows itself to me after a few plays. But if you get a bit of a block here, sleep on it is my best advice. Try doing a search online for inspirational music, maybe YouTube, and you'll open yourself up to music you may never hear without the internet to help you. It does give you access to many styles of music before you make your final choice, and buying music online is fairly easy. So I felt that I had two good images for the start of my show, but it is hard sometimes to be objective when we're selecting our own images. I'm afraid it's that confirmation bias again. We can also have too much emotional attachment, but here's a tip. Don't allow yourself to be influenced by how much time you spent producing the image, because quite often we are. Your viewers won't know or care how long you spent, or how much skill it took to produce the images. They just want to see and enjoy the pictures on screen. My second image was originally black and white, and my first image was a delicate blue tone. So I decided to change the tone of the second image to match the first, and I did that in the interests of harmony between them. So to do that, we take the image into Photoshop. Quite a quick process using the hue and saturation palette. I then took a look at the fade between these first two images because I was looking for the potential third image. This is the point where the images are both faded to around 50%, and for a moment you see a different picture, a combination of the two, which is called the third image. If I move my cursor here and I just stop midway through the 2-second fade, on screen there you can start to see a mixture of both images. I can still just see the truck on the beach from the first one, but I can see the sea from the second one coming through just above. So this has potential. The third image is a term that arose in film days when I was using projectors and electronic dissolve units, but it's much the same as what I've just shown here. It was that point where one image was faded into the next one, and for a brief moment we saw the combination of the two, and that was christened the third image. I think now we can think of this as a derivative because it becomes a physical image. So the third image never physically existed back in our film days, but it does now. Not only is it a physical third image, but my third image actually comes second in a group of three. Now this sounds a little bit odd because of that term, the third image. But when you see it on the timeline in Pictures to Exe, it makes a lot more sense. If you look down to the bottom left and I move my cursor to the extreme left, you can see there's my first image. Eventually I'll include a title, of course. There's the second image in the sequence, and you can see the derivative is sitting between the two. So as one fades to the other, and generally we will increase the fade length, you can see we get to see the derivative image, and we get to see it a lot better these days than we ever did with our film. So if we pay attention to that fade between what was image 1 and 2, or just move the cursor manually, it helps us to see any potential for this derivative third image technique. So I saw something emerge with these two images, so the next stage is to open both of them up into Photoshop, make a layered stack of them, and experiment with blending one image with another, and then using a layer mask to bring through one image a little bit stronger in strategic places. Now this technique using Photoshop can considerably enhance the third image, and it's far easier to create and control in the digital age. I've found that putting the third image or derivative into a slideshow seems to demand very little time on screen. After all, it is a combination of the two images either side, so I suppose that shouldn't surprise us. I just find that it doesn't need very much time at all. Generally speaking, the length of the fade in relation to the music is probably more important. My derivative, the first one, fades on screen in 4.5 seconds, but 1 second later it's already fading off. But visually it all works. It does take just a little trial and error to get our placings absolutely correct and to sound and look right, but it's time worth spending. So at this stage we wouldn't be seeing quite so many images as we see here, because I would have the music and the title in place, albeit maybe not the correct title yet, and I would have my first 3 images. Now one of those is going to be that derivative we've talked quite a bit about, and the 3 are working rather well. To some viewers, of course, they will be completely unaware that they're actually viewing 3 images. By the way, when I've got the entire slideshow on screen, as you can see now, please don't be too confused by the start of the slideshow, because I've got 3 slides just to bring up my title. So the first image in the sequence is my beachscape. The next one is a copy of that with the title in the place I want it, and then I've got another version of the beachscape, of course, to remove it. So when you look at those 3 at the start, they are really what I'm referring to as my first image, because the next one is the derivative, then we've got the third one, and then of course we move on. So quite a number of the images in this particular slideshow were created for the show. Now when I say created, I mean I've gone and searched for raw files through Adobe Camera Raw, and I've manipulated them and finally sized them for the slideshow. There's no animation in this show, but I did create my images at 2560 pixels by 1440, which is approximately 33% bigger than the show size of 1920-1080. I did that because if I did want to create some animation, the images would be large enough, but they're not so large that they add a burden of size to a static show, and in the end this one turned out to be a static show. Maybe I can take a slight digression here just for a moment. Many of us use images from a digital SLR, and the aspect ratio we're likely to get from them is 3:2. Yet most of the time we're trying to make a 16:9 slideshow, so somehow we've got to shoehorn a 3:2 aspect ratio image into a 16:9 show. On top of that, we may also wish to use a batch process in Photoshop and Lightroom to resize our images, but we can't do that while changing aspect ratio too. Maybe we could give some thought to using a standard image size of, let's say, 2560 pixels by 1706. That retains a 3:2 aspect ratio that we get from many cameras, but of course that can be batch processed, sized downwards in Photoshop and Lightroom fairly easily. But it does allow a 33% extra size that's going to meet most of our animation needs while not adding a burden of excessive size to a static show. Maybe I can just show you what I mean by opening up an image into the Objects and Animation screen. We know that the black area there is the size of our show, 1920-1080. The image that I've got sitting over the top has been batch processed to 2560 pixels on the long side, 1706 in height, so it retains the 3:2 aspect ratio. If I want to just cover the screen, I've got a slide style to do that if I want it, but I can go to the zoom, and if I put 119 in there, as you can see, it does cover the screen nicely. Now, many audio-visual enthusiasts would say, but if you crop the image within your image editor, you would be able to make the image more reflect the size of the slideshow. But the problem with that is we would have to trim off a bit of the top, a bit of the bottom, or we choose to use the bottom part of the picture or the top. Either way, we have to discard pixels. If we leave them in place, we do have the scope within Pictures-to-Exe to do that here. For example, I can choose to use the top of this, I can choose to use the bottom of this, or any part of it. Let me reset it back in the middle. But because I created it about 33% larger, if I just go to my zoom here, right click and select original size, there you can see the difference between our show size in the middle and the size of the file on the outside. So you can see what I mean when I say we've got ample size here to cope with most of our animation needs, and yet it's not so big that it's going to give us real size problems in a static show. Sorry about that little digression there, but I think it's worth considering. Now, when I think about synchronizing images to music, I recall recently someone asked on a forum why slideshow software cannot add slides to the beat of the music automatically. Now, I didn't think that was a very good idea, even if it could be done. Since when do we hand over probably the most creative part of audiovisual to a computer? I think the person who asked meant well, but gave away their inexperience with audiovisual. When you think about it, computers can make music on their own, but how's that worked out for us so far? Not so good. Now, the thing is, you never really know whether the image you're working on needs to begin appearing on screen at the start of an uplift in that section of music, whether the fade needs to coincide with the end part of that music section, or in fact the image needs to span more of that particular musical section. Basically, does the image go at the start, middle, or the end of that particular musical section? Now, that's going to vary for a whole host of reasons, including our own personal choice. This is something which is not easy to explain. It's one of those things where we know it when we see it, and in our case, hear it too. I shuffle images around the timeline for ages, and every time I come back to a partly made show, I find myself making small adjustments until I feel I have them placed perfectly. But I can only really say perfectly for me. Another thought I have on this subject is how much time do we keep images on screen generally? One reaction I've had to the audiovisual I make is that I don't leave the images on screen long enough. Now, I suppose I could turn that comment around and claim it as something positive. At least people would like to see my images longer, but I'm not sure they would, and I think they're missing the point just a bit. If you watch television programs today, there are quite a number of them, where the longest video clip you'll see is less than 3 seconds. I've often been watching a television program, and a car build program is pretty typical, but there's going to be others too. As a new video clip appears on screen, do the seconds count, 1 and 2 and 3, etc. You'll find that in a lot of cases you will never get to the count of 3, or very rarely. So practically every 10 seconds of video content we view is likely to be made up of 4 video clips. Now, we hardly seem to notice this at the time, and I think if we were questioned sometime later our perception may be that the clips were 10 seconds, 20, 30 seconds long. You should try this with some of the TV programs you watch. It's quite eye-opening. When we look back at the start of this particular slideshow, we can see that the second image, and I'm talking about the derivative here, think of the first three as one, so here's our second image. The second image is only on screen for 1 second. You can see the gap between the grey bar between number 5 and number 6. Now the 1 second gap between those two slides, of course, is the time when the image is not fading on or off the screen. Yet let's look at the same thing in the slide list here. There's the image we're looking at. When we look at the slide duration down at the bottom right corner of the thumbnail, we can see that it's 9.6 seconds. So subtracting the 1 second it's fully on screen means that this particular image is seen by the viewers mostly in the 8.6 seconds as it's fading on screen and off. But when we see it and hear the music, that's enough. So my point here is, if television isn't keeping video clips on screen for more than a few seconds, then perhaps that's a pointer to us who create audiovisual that we can actually keep our still images on screen far too long. I think our attention is retained much better when there's a certain flow to the slideshow that we're viewing. And I also think it's better to leave your audience wanting rather than risk boring them a little. This is another one of those things that's difficult to quantify, but it's something I try to keep in mind. If my images are that powerful that the viewer wants to see them longer, I am delighted about that. But in that case, the viewer can always run the show again. To be honest, it's often the music that defines when we make a slide change. That's what synchronization is. Otherwise, it can be a little bit like clapping out of time to the band at a concert. It's just wrong. The flow, or the beat in this case, is interrupted. By the way, I was particularly pleased with this derivative, because if you can create a third image that could conceivably be used as a standalone image in its own right, then I think that's a pretty good indicator that you've got the process just about right. So after the first few slides have been added and we're starting to get into the flow, I try to find images that will fade well with the previous one and also work well with the music, and I do test this over and over again in Pictures2Exe, while at the same time I'm still looking for potential third image pictures, but I'm aware that I mustn't overdo things. When I moved on to the fourth image and the fifth image in my show, these were both black and white, but once again I took them into Photoshop and gave them a similar blue tone to the first three, so that I had a nice harmony at the start of the show. In Photoshop it's quite easy to do. If you go to your hue and saturation palette and tick the colorize box, adding a delicate tone is very easy using the two sliders hue and saturation. The next third image I used was the Angel of the North statue. Now this is a big bold shape and it does lend itself well to the third image technique. We can see the potential pretty easily if we just allow this image here to fade from this to this. We can see this one start to form, but if we move the slider manually, that helps too. Then we can open up both of those images into Photoshop. Now we can do this with a nice shortcut key in Pictures2Exe, Control W. I have asked the manufacturers that consideration be given for us to be able to highlight more than one image and open them directly from Photoshop into our image editor, and the third image technique was what I had in mind, and I've been told that this will be implemented in a future version of Pictures2Exe. If we look at the three images that ends with the Angel of the North, this one here, there's the derivative, and there's the Angel of the North, we can see that the derivative part of the three images has almost no time at all fully on screen. There you can see the gap is almost nothing. So what I'm doing here really is just relying on the fade on and off screen over 6.5 seconds, because the viewer never really gets to see it fully on screen for more than a fraction of a second. Now when I think about the third image from my film and slide tape days, that's more or less what the third image was, a fleeting glimpse of another image as two images faded from one to the other. Those three images in total are on screen for about 16 seconds. That includes fades on and off. Now that's just a little over 5 seconds each, and while it doesn't sound a long time, it works fine visually, especially when we take into account the third image technique. Every time that I come back to my project, maybe the next day or maybe even a few days later, I put on my headphones and I run a full screen preview of what I have so far. Now sometimes that's enough to have me tinkering with what I've already done, and maybe on that particular session I don't even get to add any new images. But even when I don't start tinkering and I want to move on, a full screen preview is nice to get my thoughts back on track from where I left off. The length we make our slideshow is a personal choice, but when it comes to a pictorial slideshow, a short sequence is going to work much better. I'm not even going to suggest it's a personal choice. It's not. Keep it short. It doesn't matter how good your images may be, there's still a limit to how long someone is willing to sit and view images. Now I have about 35 different images in the show, and I suppose with derivatives you'll add 3 or 4 more. And I decided to bring it to a close and fade out my music around 3 minutes 40 seconds. And after watching the show a number of times, I think that was long enough. Audiovisual is all about the presentation of images, but I believe there's a very fine line between creating something appealing and something less so. It's very easy to allow our enthusiasm and our confirmation bias to affect our judgment, especially on slideshow length, and other aspects of our show too. I think that as we come up with our audio-visual ideas and we walk along that fine line between good and not so good, it's very easy for us to slip either way, and I think that's true for the experienced and less experienced alike. The way that I try to stay on the right side of that line is to be patient. Once I've created my show, I don't publish it and I don't show it to anyone, particularly my partner at home here. Can you imagine spending quite a long time putting a slideshow together, and then you ask your partner what they think of it? They know you've put your heart and soul into this thing, so they're very likely to give you the answer they think you're looking for. You're much better off to just live with the slideshow yourself for as long as it takes. What I do is I place the finished slideshow on my desktop. I play it every morning while I drink my coffee, and any time I come back to my PC through the day, I may run it again. This is a really good exercise and you should try it. If you finish your slideshow on Monday and you watch it a couple of times a day until Friday, if you're not making changes to your show by then, you're either a genius at this, or maybe you're not yet seeing the problems. I'll leave you to choose which one is most likely to be true. It rarely takes me more than a day or two until I start to make 1 or 2 changes. Maybe not big ones, they're small tweaks, a little change here, a little change there, but all for the better. One of the important things that I try to do with every slideshow I make is to make a good first impression. Because what I'm trying to do is to capture my audience and keep them watching for the first few seconds. Then, if I'm successful at that, I'm likely to keep them for, in this case, the 3 minutes 40 seconds that I need. And I think we shouldn't lose track of the fact that we're also trying to entertain. There's nothing wrong with a bit of entertainment while we're presenting our images. Now, if you've reached the end of this presentation, I do congratulate you, because I have made a video here which is considerably different to my usual style. That fact alone, the fact that you're still with me, tells me you probably have more than a passing interest in audio visual. In that case, why not come along and join my photo and audio visual forum at the address you can see on screen. It's completely free of charge, and you can meet other enthusiasts too. If you're interested in purchasing the software to make audio-visual slideshows, come along to my website at the address on screen. The software is available there, so are quite a number of video tutorials on the subject, and also quite a number on Photoshop and Lightroom too.